Good afternoon. I'm Suzanne Borden, Moment Magazine's Zoominar producer, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, The Holocaust in Latin America, a conversation with Ilan Stavans and Spokoiny. Today's program, which is being recorded, is part of a special Zoominar series on anti-Semitism hosted by Moment Magazine with the support of the Joyce and Irving Goldman Family Foundation. Please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the session. Following the program, please visit Moment's website, where you can sign up to receive Moment's Anti-Semitism Monitor, and where you'll also find a variety of articles on the topic of anti-Semitism. And be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, Adapting Jewish Literature, Yentl and a Tale of Love and Darkness, with Fania O. Salzberger, Ruby Namdar, and Rachel Kafrison. Now for today's program. Ilan Stavans, originally from Mexico, is the Louis C. Brigg Professor of Humanities, Latin American and Latino Culture at Amherst College. He is the author and translator of numerous books, including The Seventh Heaven, Travels Through the Jewish Latin America. Spokoiny is president and CEO of the Jewish Funders Network. Originally from Argentina, Andres has a multidisciplinary academic background, including business education and rabbinical studies in different institutions around the world. Please welcome Ilan Stavans and Spokoiny.
Thank you, Susan, and great to be talking to you, Ilan. It's a pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Un placer.
Yeah. This is the second time we talk about these issues, and it's going to be a different angle, but I hope equally riveting. Of course, I'm biased. I think that Latin American Jewry is really a fascinating topic, and the topic of anti-Semitism in Latin America, it's at the same time unique and interesting, but it can offer some insights for anti-Semitism in North America and in other parts of the world. So I hope that everybody finds this conversation interesting and stimulating. You can put questions in the chat. We're going to have Susan is going to coordinate a Q&A later on, but we can, if there's something that comes up and we can talk about it during the conversation, we will do so. But let's start from the very beginning, right? There are a lot of preconceived ideas, not all of them accurate, about Latin American Jewry. So if you can give us in 30 seconds from your exploration, your traveling, your works, your books, how would you describe Latin American Jewry? And knowing that it's not an homogeneous thing, it's a very diverse group, but how would you paint a picture of it?
Well, it's a pleasure to be in conversation with you again, Andres, and to be part of this wonderful series on anti-Semitism at Moment Magazine. Latin American Jewry is one of the most important concentration of Jews in the world today. Demographically, in terms of numbers, is a very significant one, though for a variety of reasons, historical, cultural, it is often misunderstood or put aside or not considered the way it should. Altogether, the various republics that constitute what we call today Latin America have been a landscape where Jews have been present from the very moment where the region arrived to modernity in 1492, where Columbus and his crew brought in the very first new Christians or crypto-Jews or Anusim or Marranos, those that were escaping the Inquisition in the Middle Ages and in the early Renaissance. And for many of them, the cross of the Atlantic signified a search for a refuge, a land where they would not be under the fist of El Santo Oficio, the Inquisition. Throughout the 500 plus centuries in Latin America, there have been Jews that have arrived in successive waves. During that colonial period, other secret Jews, silent Jews from Sfarad, from Spain, arrived sometimes in an unacknowledged way because they were quiet, hidden about their identity. From the roughly 1880s to 1930s, two successive immigrant waves take place. I'm talking specifically about Jewish waves. One is from Ashkenaz, the Pale of Settlement, the Eastern European region of shtetls where Yiddish speakers lived, where pogroms, anti-Semitism, poverty pushed people aside, and in search of better places, with the help of philanthropic organizations and individuals like the Baron Maurice de Hirsch, they settled in Argentina, in Brazil, in other parts of South America, in the Caribbean, and in Mexico and Central America as well. That is the Ashkenazi immigration. Concurrent with it was the Ottoman immigration, Jews from Syria, Lebanon, Turkey, Greece, and what we call the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia, Jews who had been there either from the expulsion of Spain in 1492 or Mizrahi Jews that had been there after the destruction of the Second Temple, also because of poverty, because of the crumbling politics of the Ottoman Empire, and because of growing anti-Semitism, made the cross to Peru, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Bolivia. In those two, one of them was speaking Yiddish, the Ottoman Jews came with Ladino, came with Arabic, came with French, depending on the community. And then there is another very significant wave, if not two more. One is the wave that takes place roughly between 1933, 1934, with the arrival of Hitler elected into power in Germany, and during the Second World War. The refugees, the survivors of the Holocaust, Latin America will become a very important theater where escaping from the Second World War, from the Axis, particularly from Nazi Germany, will constitute an important route that will be concurrent with the so-called rat route, the former Nazis that will escape after 1945 and arrive at the very same places in Bolivia, in Uruguay, in Paraguay, in Brazil, in Argentina. And sometimes survivors of the Holocaust will be living in the very same neighborhoods where former Nazis like Dr. Mengele or Josef Mengele or Adolf Eichmann or others will be living. And this is a very painful, crucial moment. And the last one, very quickly to conclude this part, Andres, is the arrival of Israelis to Latin America. Very significant one. All over Latin America, all age groups of Israelis, entrepreneurs, former soldiers, volunteers, educators, have come to Latin America, to the Jewish communities, and to other aspects of society, and started a new life, or simply created links with Zionist links or ideological links with the State of Israel. All in all, maybe around 500,000 Jews altogether, between 400 and 500,000 in a region, Latin America, that has approximately 450 million people. The number is really minuscule. Many Latin Americans hardly ever really come face to face with Jews. The Jewish communities in Latin America, to different extents, in Argentina, like your country, in Mexico, like mine, can be insular in and of themselves, and the interaction with the outside world might be small. But nonetheless, it's a very important region because of the culture that is emerging from there, from Jews, because of the role that Jews have had in politics, in medicine, in science, in education. And my view is that it's going to define the way we see Jewry in the 21st century.
Right, and as you said, the different countries have different ethos, and the Jews in a way replicate those ethos, like Mexico.
Absolutely.
And you know better than me, it's a stratified society, so Jews are also stratified, and the part of it, Argentina, Uruguay are more open, middle-class societies, so it's the degree of assimilation there is different, and the integration, but And a community that has 500 years of history with very unique characteristics, also incredible moments of openness and integration. We had countries in Latin and Central America that had Jewish presidents, like Costa Rica or Panama,
Exactly. Yeah.
and way before some countries on Europe or North America had them. So, in this context of an old community of immigrants, refugees coming from all sides, how was the Holocaust lived and perceived? What was the impact of the Holocaust when it was happening and after? Let's start in the late 30s and 40s.
It's important to keep in mind that the Nazi ideology was an expansionist ideology. It starts in Germany with the arrival of Hitler as a chancellor, and it has global ambitions that will go to Poland first through an invasion, other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, and eventually try to reach way beyond the European stage. The Nazi ideology looks at Africa, looks at crossing Gibraltar and going to Africa and expanding itself over there. And starting already in 1939, there is what is called Operación Bolívar, a Bolivar operation, where there are certain spies and figures that are sent by the Nazi regime to crucial countries like Argentina, Uruguay, Cuba, Colombia, Mexico, where they will try to find and structure bastions of support for the Axis that can slowly infiltrate the various governments depending on the trend of the government and the particular juncture. It's also very important to remember, Andres, and you know this very well, that in certain parts of South America, Argentina, Bolivia, there had been a German immigration at the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, that in some ways planted the seeds of the support for what was happening in Germany, 33, 34, up until 1930.
There was that, and there was a tradition, especially in the military. I mean, the militaries of Latin America, of Southern Latin America at least, were modeled after the Prussian army. So there was a Philo-German attitude in the military and an Anglophile, Francophile attitude in the conservative ruling elite. So those two clashed in the late 30s and 40s. And it depends, at some moment, the Francophile, the Anglophile wing prevails. And in other moments, the Philo-German wing prevails. But the Germans are actively trying to influence that.
And this is not only in the military, as you well put it, but it happens also in the intellectual elite, where a number of different figures in Argentina, I should say, connected with the first part of the first question that you asked, that of all this constellation of countries, Argentina is by far the largest in terms of the number of Jews that live today and have always lived in Latin America. It was a magnet of Jewish immigration at the end of the 19th century. There were agricultural colonies in the Pampas that were crucial mechanisms to attract Eastern European Jews in particular, and they later on transitioned to the city. And in that atmosphere, the Germanophile aspect of the non-Jewish intelligentsia is a crucial factor. There were in the 1920s and 30s a number of important publications that, in the form of novels, in the form of pamphlets, in the form of full-fledged books that argued that the arrival of Jewish immigrants to Argentina, to Uruguay, to South America was a way to surrender the national sovereignty, that these immigrants were slowly taking over and going to deteriorate and reconfigure altogether the national character.
And because they came from Russia, many of them, they were accused of being communists. Yeah.
And back in 1919, when the Jewish immigration was at its apex, at its height, the first and so far, fortunately, only pogrom, so to speak, ever to take place in this continent, from Canada to South America, it took place. It's called the Semana Trágica, or the Tragic Week. Some historians describe it as a pogrom, others describe it as a labor unrest that had clear anti-Semitic messages. Either way, the Jews were targets, Jewish businesses, Jewish individuals, and that kind of anti-Semitism, the spread of literature like the Protocols of the Wives of Zion, that was widely and still is available in the Spanish-speaking world, the publication of the Spanish translation of Henry IV's The International Jew, that was also very influential in Latin America. All that set the tone for the kind of Germanophilia that would mark the 30s in many places of Latin America. And that was dramatically colored by the influence of a racial theory, that the whiter you are, the Aryan race, the more superior, and that gets infiltrated in different parts of Latin America with a variety of thinkers that will try to still support Nazism, Hitler, but will present an alternative racial view. There's a very important thinker in Mexico called José Vasconcelos, a friend of Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, a minister of education and the founder of the most important university in Mexico and likely in Latin America, the National University of Mexico. Vasconcelos argued that it wasn't the Aryan race, but it was the mestizo race. He called it the cosmic race that would eventually be called to replace the Nazis, the Aryans, the white Germans, and conquer the world itself, very much in the fashion of the type of pseudoscience that was taking place in Europe. But in order to wrap this part, Andres, in 1939, a very important moment that happens in the history of the Jews of Latin America that will...
The St. Louis.
The St. Louis. To this day, it feels like a wound that doesn't heal. The MS St. Louis, this boat that leaves Germany with almost 1,000 Jews that are escaping, that have been sponsored by Jewish organizations, arrives in Cuba with the hope of allowing them to disembark. And because of a political juncture that happens there at the time, also in Roosevelt and in the United States, is not allowing them in. It is called the Ship of Fools. It's an image that comes from Plato, and many of them will be stationed in Havana Harbor, not allowed to go down. They will try to enter the United States, they will be rejected, try to enter Canada, eventually go back to Europe, and many of them will die in the Holocaust, in Auschwitz and other concentration camps. And it's a very important moment because Cubans on the street were hoping to open the doors. The politicians, corrupt, were hoping to get money in order to open the doors or not, and were kind of playing tricks with the United States. And the fact is that many of them ended up going back. I had a relative in the MS St. Louis that went back to Europe and died. You're muted, Andres.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, one thing to really remember here is that it's not that the Latin Americans and the Cubans in this particular case were particularly evil. Like, all countries in the Western world were close to Jews. In fact, while this was happening, Jews were being smuggled into places like Bolivia and Chile, Mexico, exactly, to an extent. So, yeah. So there's lights and shadows here, right? In the
attitude. Absolutely. Another aspect of this light and shadow is a very interesting one. In the Dominican Republic, just as, you know, many of these countries have had tyrants, dictators, and the dictators, one would think, would sympathize with Mussolini and with Stalin and with Hitler, but Trujillo, arguably the most feared and vicious of dictators in Latin America, makes a deal with Jewish organizations and allows Jewish refugees to come to the Dominican Republic and gives them a portion of land. It's really acquired land. That's how the land is sold. It's the region of Sasua, where they will recreate a kind of shtetl, like the one that they left in Eastern Europe. And today, the Sasua region is still a museum where you can go and see the first mikvah and the first cemetery and the first Yiddish school. Many of the Sasuan Jews just lived there for a few years and eventually made it to the United States. But those that lived there felt a sense of community, and even their children. I've met the children of Sasuan Jews in the United States who still see that period as a safe haven. They opened the door that Europe had closed, and the United States was playing cards, sometimes yes and sometimes no. And this comes from Trujillo, the feared figure in Latin America. So it's not always the case where a dictator will necessarily be the case
of Franco. Franco, saved Jews, even though he was a bloody, dictator in his own day.
Absolutely, and depending on the moment in Spain, in Franco, he would either do it because out of goodwill, or there was money involved.
Money, right?
There were members of the diplomatic service in Spain that were pushing him. But those are important factors that call that wishy-washy aspect that you're talking about.
So the tide eventually turns. The mid-40s. Latin American countries realize that the Germans are going to lose the war. They try, as they can, to realign with the winning side. And then there's a second moment, which is immigration of Jews and Nazis, as you said at the beginning, into Latin America. So what happens in the aftermath of the Holocaust? How that story gets told in the 50s, 60s, and until this day?
I think, like you, I'd love to hear from your side here, Andres, too, because we've talked about other things, but I am the grandchild of Yiddish-speaking immigrants and families that were defined by the Holocaust, and large portions of my father's mother, for instance, the family ended up dying in Auschwitz and in other concentration camps. But I remember growing up in Mexico and seeing relatives that had just arrived in 1946 or 47. I was born in 1961, but that many years later would be teaching Yiddish in schools where I went, that had their numbers tattooed, and you would see them with a certain kind of awe and fear, not quite really understanding what those numbers were. They would speak about them, or they would be quiet about them. Latin America became a place where the Jewish, particularly the Yiddish community, saw itself as probably prolonging the culture of Yiddishkeit beyond the destruction in 1945.
Mostly the secular community, right?
The secular community.
Because the big Hasidic courts moved to the US or Israel, but the secular...
The Bundists, the Yiddishists, the ones that saw language and culture as the bridge or the connection with the past. I'm a product of that kind of Yiddishkeit. It was a kind of religion without the religion. You felt that through the language, you were connected with that world that had been destroyed. And you felt that you were in Latin America more by accident, at least in my case, by the accident of history. Some of the grandparents wanted to come to the United States and quotas were not allowed, or others ended up in Europe. And the relationship between the Jews and Mexico was one of gratitude, but it was also somewhat ambivalent. We're here, maybe temporarily, who knows how long. Maybe we will go to the United States, or we will immigrate to Israel and do Aliyah at some point. It's important to know that at that time, many Nazis were also coming to these parts, as we were saying, very important Nazis helped by the Vatican, of particular governments. Chile became a center of former Nazis that changed their names, Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina. And of course, some of the most famous ones are Dr. Mengele and Eichmann. Dr. Mengele had been on the radar of Simon Wiesenthal of the Mossad. He died before
in Brazil.
In Brazil, and apparently he drowned in the ocean. And he had been changing addresses from one place to another. He, of course, was the man who was instrumental in doing many of the pseudoscientific experiments with twins and others in Auschwitz.
And there is a watershed moment in terms of, so first of all, one thing before I go there. One element that for me was fascinating when I discovered it, because I was always focused on the tension, as you mentioned at the beginning, Jewish refugees and Nazis coming together and maybe sharing the same thing. But there's another story, which is anti-Nazi, not Jewish Germans that had escaped Nazism, and then they find themselves sharing the same German language, like the Goethe Institute in Buenos Aires or the Pestalozzi, with those same Nazis that they escaped from. It's a fascinating story. I
just want to take a second, because Latin America has for a long time had this tradition of being the safe haven both to the right and to the left of different groups. During the Spanish Civil War, if I could just add to this, we would also have those that were very close to Franco that had immigrated to Mexico, for instance, and those that were escaping the Republicans that were escaping. And sometimes they would coexist there in a way that they couldn't coexist in Spain. But go ahead.
Yeah, sometimes they would coexist, and then, but in the literature of the 30s from Buenos Aires, you have people telling about street battles between the Frankists and their Republicans, and depending where they came from, etc. But just going back to Nazi escapees, and there's a watershed moment in 1960, of course, with the capture of Eichmann, right?
Yeah. This is the crucial moment in a moment, Andres, that I think still needs to be visited with a objective and thorough eyes, because the perception that it offers is one that Latin America offers outside in the United States and Europe and Israel is very different from the perception of Latin American Jews, particularly like you, Argentine Jews. 1960, finally, out of an arrangement between the Mossad and the German government, Eichmann, who by that time had changed his name to Ricardo Clement, is spotted, and he is kidnapped by a series of Mossad operatives in one of the suburbs of Buenos Aires. He is put in a home, and with the support of Ben-Gurion, this is about 12 years after the creation of the State of Israel, he is flown in an El Al flight to the State of Israel in a triumphant kind of kidnapping that becomes a watershed moment, because the Jewish state now can have one of the most important, if not the most important, former Nazi put on trial and be seen as a young nation that will ratify the judicial system and bring to justice those that put the Jews in such an atrocious situation during 39 and 45. This transportation of Eichmann to Israel is a crucial test for Ben-Gurion. One of the most famous books about it is by Hannah Arendt, Eichmann in Jerusalem, where she talks about the banality of evil. In that book itself will become very controversial. But in Argentina, the idea of a foreign nation sending spies, operatives, to take one of its citizens, regardless of its ideology, out in a secretive way and flying them to stand on trial is seen as a betrayal and as a national aggression of the sovereignty of the nation. And what is not known, this is a triumphant moment for Nazis being brought to justice, but what is not known is the anti-Semitic repercussions that will take place from 1960, 1962, when Eichmann is finally found guilty and condemned to death and hung, to throughout the 60s of targeting the Jewish community in Buenos Aires, of La Plata, in other parts of Latin America, as the scapegoat, so to speak, because they are connected with the state of Israel. And this puts the Jewish community in Argentina at a juncture it has not seen before. And something important happens that I think needs to be seen more thoroughly. The Jews know that the government is not going to defend them because the government is involved in this big controversy of claiming that Eichmann should not have been kidnapped. So they decide to organize a kind of paramilitary army that will be in self-defense in order to be protected from the anti-Semitic outburst that will be taking place. It's a kind of Jabotinsky-inspired idea of we are a small minority, the government is ready to throw us into the oven again, and we need to do something for ourselves. And it's important, I was a member some years later of a similar paramilitary group in Mexico.
The Misgueret.
And that, we were trained in order to be able to do for our communities what this idea may be seen as anathema in the United States, the idea that you could organize yourselves.
Not anymore.
But not anymore, exactly. Used to be. And I think that in that sense, Latin American Jews have a lesson to teach of what do you do in times when the government and the police might not be the impartial entities that, and we saw it with the sedition, we saw it in the last years of the Trump administration, a subject of big discussion. But this is one of the most important moments in Latin America, connected still with the Holocaust.
So the Jews are basically confronting there for the first time the issue of the double loyalty that now becomes so, now in the States everybody's talking about it, but Latin American Jews confronted that very early on.
Yeah. And I think that Latin American Jews have written about it, have they articulated a series of theories of how to handle it. It is never easy. Where do you stand? Are you an Argentine? Are you a Jew?
I mean, when I was a child, the question I always got is, if there's a football match between Argentina and Israel, who do you root for?
Exactly. And another aspect that is important to remember, Andres, is that something happens after the Yom Kippur War in the late 70s, and particularly during the 80s, where the goodwill internationally toward Israel changes. And now Israel is seen as a colonialist, aggressive.
Yeah.
And in Latin America, Israel by then has had close ties with different regimes of different types, selling weapons in Central America, for certain groups during the Contras affair, in other parts of the region. And that the left really sympathize with an anti-Israeli approach that I would say creates this anti-Semitism that turns into anti-Zionism. It's no more just the Jews because they're Jews, but the Jews that are here because they are an extremity of the state of Israel, even if they are not, that needs to be targeted because we can't really target directly the Israeli state.
So there's something interesting here. On the one hand, Jews are being targeted. On the other hand, Latin America and Argentina especially becomes the theater of the Middle East conflict, with the bombing of the Israeli embassy and the bombing of the AMIA building, which has really nothing to do with Argentina. I mean, it happens there, but it's basically a manifestation. It's a soft target that Hezbollah chooses because there's a Shiite community that can help them, and because there are targets there that they can use. But it is yet another moment in which the local community is suffering for something that happens in Israel or with Israel.
I would say, just along those lines, that in the 90s, the attack against the Israeli embassy happens in 92. The attack against the AMIA, much bigger in scale. The suffering is not measurable, but it's just the scale of the event, happens in 1994. And it is the moment in which Latin American Jews, inadvertently, as you say, maybe, became part of the Middle Eastern conflict and were no longer peripheral to what was happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But there's another very important factor here. Outside of the Middle East, Latin America has the largest concentration of Palestinians. Chile, in particular, has a huge Palestinian diaspora, whereas the Jewish community in Chile might not be bigger than 8,000 to 10,000. There are 5-6 million Palestinians in Chile. It was a
600,000.
And that, I think, places the chessboard in such a way that, yes, you were just a Jewish community, but now your neighbors have different loyalties, different interests. There were communities of Germans that had existed for a long time. Now there are big communities of Palestinians, and you are who you have been for the last 100 years or 200 years, but your view has to change. You have to adapt yourself, and that happens in the 21st century.
So we come to the 2000s, and then we have sort of a confluence of all those streams of anti-Semitism. Like on the one hand, you have the traditional right wing, let's call it right wing for lack of a better term, right? Sort of a Catholic conservative anti-Semitism that is inherited from the Inquisition and then takes on yet another racial dimension with the Germans and whatever. So that's one stream. Second stream is the Arab populations that, as you mentioned, I mean, there's another reason why the AMIA bombing happened in Buenos Aires is because, as you said, there's a network of local support, not necessarily of Argentinians, but of, Arab immigrants living in the triple frontier area between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina.
Exactly, sure.
But so that's the second stream. And the third stream is what you alluded to, which is that sympathy with, or that antipathy towards Israel because of that sort of identification of the Palestinian cause with the Latin American revolutionary movements, kind of kind of Yasser Arafat is like the Che Guevara, and everything gets lumped together, and the progressive left kind of.
And maybe the crucial figure in that sense, in the last version, Andres, that you are describing, is Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. Hugo Chavez comes from the tradition of seeing the left as it was with Fidel Castro, with Che Guevara. It goes back many centuries to figures like Bartolomé de las Casas, a priest that wanted to defend the indigenous population. So the left has always been very, very clear in its view. But something happens with Hugo Chavez at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century in Venezuela, where he uses the left-wing messages and targets the Jewish community in Caracas. He helps, or at least is silent when there are desecrations of Jewish cemeteries and desecrations of synagogues. And he directly links Israel with the United States and with the idea of colonialism, with the idea of the killing of the Palestinians, and makes the equation of the Holocaust of Jews, 39-45, with the Holocaust of Palestinians that is taking place in the so-called occupied territories. It's a very important moment because the rhetoric has changed. And that rhetoric, again, for a small Jewish community that is not always very sophisticated in preparing itself for the challenges, they have to catch up with the transformation of the discourse that is going on and realize that governments are now looking at them. While sometimes they can be very ambivalent about the Israeli policies of Netanyahu and others, regardless of that, they will be seen as symbols, as extremities, as kind of allegorical representations of Israel in Latin America. And so it's just like you're saying, a configuration, a conjunction of a variety of anti-Semitic moves that are church-sponsored, that see the Jews as a cabal of business that is taking over, and as Marxists that now is mixed with the topic of Israel.
So the Jews are at the same time capitalist, Marxist, oppressors,
Everything you want.
anything you want. But there's something like one of the comments here that I think it's interesting. You know, the lack of justice, for example, in the case of AMIA, it comes to a point because here it's Latin America, and because not all the countries are equally, disorganized, but there is an element of when nobody goes to jail because the bombing of AMIA, you can never identify whether that's, regular inefficiency, negligence, and corruption, or anti-Semitism. Like the two things get together, right? Like, yeah.
And I would add to that whereas the United States and the European nations are built on a structure of a legal code that is central to how those countries see themselves, Latin American republics have had always a haphazard approach to justice. Who can be put in justice, who can be judged, who cannot, and how all this is manipulated. In the case of the AMIA, the prolonged case of nobody going to jail with AMIA, and the government of Carlos Menem, who was in power, of Lebanese descent at that time, kind of prolongs itself, one politician after another, is just a statement of how the role of justice in Latin America can be more of a bureaucratic maze that never really resolves itself, and leave many with a sense of lack of closure, that the confusion between what the government wants and what the anti-Semites want and what forces from the outside. And in the end, it feels like nothing is clear, and it's all a series of confusions. And that is something that advances anti-Semitism.
Which is something similar to what happened with the suicide, murder, who knows, of Nisman, the prosecutor.
Yeah, the prosecutor that died just a day or two before, revealing what his investigation with Cristina, who was president at that time, the investigation of what he had found, and he murdered.
And we will never know, what was the cause of it. And sometimes because people are covering it up, and sometimes because simply the system doesn't work as it should, or as it does in other countries.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's one more aspect that I think I'd like to mention here, and that is that in the last maybe 4 decades or 5 decades, there has been an enormous influx of Latin American immigrants to the United States. And I dare to suggest that there is another republic, a new Latin American republic inside the United States. There are close to 60 million Latinos in this country. And it's truly a Bolivarian dream, because these Latinos come from all over Latin America. It is Bolivar dreamed of creating an entire continent that would be a republic of republics. And now, ironically, that dream is within the United States, where Argentinians and Puerto Ricans and Cubans and Dominicans and Colombians and Mexicans all coexist. Studies have shown, Andres, that those that arrive from Latin America to the United States, this is from the Anti-Defamation League, are more anti-Semitic than the children of Latin Americans, the children already born in the United States. In other words, that the process of assimilation to the melting pot, or however we want to describe what the American system is, it diminishes the degree of anti-Jewish emotions. Nonetheless, it doesn't disappear altogether. And I think it's something to watch closely, the way the Hispanic community in the United States responds to issues of various types of anti-Semitism, and in what way literature and other forms of education can help to cure or to diminish that aspect. Because if the Latino community in the United States can be a lab, a kind of microcosm where the education changes, the impact on Latin America is also going to be very important.
Because there's communication between, and because and probably most immigrants to Latin America, sorry, more immigrants to the United States from Latin America come from places where there are no Jews. So their anti-Semitic attitudes are actually, in many cases, come from ignorance, right?
Sure.
Like Argentinian immigrants to the U.S. don't tend to have, anti-Semitic views.
Yeah.
This
is a very important, as you know, a very important feature of anti-Semitism without Jews. Spain had anti-Semitism without Jews for centuries. After 1492, there were no Jews in Spain for a long, long time, but that doesn't mean there was no anti-Semitism. There was anti-Semitism in the 18th century, in the 19th century, novels written with specific anti-Semitic characters by Benito Pérez Galdós and others. So you don't need Jews to be anti-Semitic. And that is even more dangerous.
That's what Sartre said. If the Jew didn't exist, the anti-Semite would invent him.
Exactly.
But so one last point before we open to questions. I mean, actually, two little points. One is the whole story of the desaparecidos during the dictatorship in Argentina, where Jews were disproportionately targeted. This notion that Jews were 1% of the population, but represented 10% of the people killed by the dictatorship. Like they were singled out by a government that was very interesting. It was fiercely anti-Semitic and fiercely pro-Israel. Also, anticipating a phenomenon that we see now with Hungary and countries that are very pro-Israel but are very anti-Semitic.
Yeah, and maybe the best book to see this role that the Jews have as targets of the military in Argentina and how they, in the minds of the torturers of the dirty war, are connected with the Holocaust and the Nazis, is a book by Jacobo Timmerman, a very important journalist at that time, called A Prisoner Without a Name, Cell Without a Number. Yeah. That he, because he was the editor of La Opinión, was imprisoned. He tells the story of being imprisoned. And there's a particularly crushing scene in which he is being tortured by these two military figures. And they tell him, we are going to finish the job that the Nazis left unfinished. We are going to kill you. We're going to torture you the way they should have done 40 years prior. And Timmerman says very clearly, it's clear that they see themselves as connected with the Nazis. They are now the new incarnation. And it's a very important moment in the military junta where they see some of the models of torture too as connected with what the Nazis had. And there will be a series of literary artifacts that will circulate, particularly in Chile, Andres, that will claim, there's a very important figure in Chile that was a friend of Carl Gustav Jung,
yeah,
the psychoanalyst friend of Freud, student of Freud. And his name is Miguel Serrano. And the argument of Serrano in a series of books is that Hitler did not die in a bunker. Hitler managed to make it across the Atlantic, in that the Fourth Reich is going to come in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, and Uruguay. And in 3 or 4 books, he sets the tone of this arrival of the next Reich that is going to complete the task that was left unfinished in 1945. And you can see that very clearly during the Guerra Sucia, the dirty war, and the role that the military have targeting the Jews for something that was suspended before.
So just to finish before we give it back to Suzanne for questions, a word about, we talked about anti-Semitism, we talked about suffering, we talked about all this violence, but Judaism in Latin America is a very vibrant culture. We're both product of that, and the type of the richness of Jewish life there, And as I said at the beginning, the integration of the Jews is the other side of that, right? Jews live happy and fulfilling lives as Jews in that part of the world. So if you can leave us with a vignette of that wealth, of that richness.
Absolutely, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for that question, because the impression, though I feel it is my duty to talk about anti-Semitism, to study it, to understand its roots and how it has changed, I fear that when only talking about anti-Semitism in Latin America, we forget how that the Jewish communities there have thrived, have produced astonishing literature, astonishing cinema, music. They have entered the world of dance, in politics. And this Jewish community in Latin America is a very sophisticated, very nuanced, it's fascinating. It moves in every direction. There's a revival of orthodoxy among Jews in Latin America. There is also a deep commitment to social justice. There is a very informed elite that sees itself as connected with Israel and with parts of the United States. Another one that is more tied to the indigenous population. And I spent about 8 years ago, 5 years altogether traveling through the Jewish communities of Latin America, trying to understand its metabolism, its DNA. And I was enriched at every point. Latin America claims to be the place where the 10 lost tribes, apparently in the Bible, went, and there are communities of indigenous people in Peru, in Mexico, that claim to be the descendants of the lost tribes.
You never know.
There are crypto Jews that are coming out now and writing about their own experience. You yourself have just published a novel about the colonial period in Latin America, about the role of the secrecy and the Inquisition, that is terrific. And I think that there is a lot that is happening there that is worth exploring in detail, and that, as I said at the beginning, it will leave a deep mark in world Jewry in the 21st century.
Amazing. So there are tons of questions I'm seeing at the Q&A. So Suzanne, maybe you can select a few, and knowing that we're not going to exhaust this, but at least we're going to try and cover a little bit of it.
Yes, thank you. And also there are quite a few questions that people wrote in ahead of time. So we'll start with, what is the prevalence of anti-Semitism in Latin America today? Has there been a rise of anti-Semitism in Latin America over the last several years, like we've seen in the United States? And then I'll combine it with a third question. Is it different, the type of anti-Semitism that you see in Latin America versus what you see in the United States today?
Andres, I want you to also come here and share your views. I don't want to be the only one. Anti-Semitism in Latin America is a constant. We have noticed in the United States, particularly in the 4 years of Trump, more of a white supremacy, neo-Nazi groups. Many of those groups in their own format have been active for quite a long time in Latin America, in the margins and sometimes in the center, depending on the government in office. As we have tried to explore, the anti-Semitism in Latin America can come from many fronts. It can come from the left, it can come from the right, it can come from the church, it can come from ignorance, it can come from very educated people, and it can come from a media where you thought that there was a connection with there was a love for the Jews, and especially with Israel, that pushes the Latin American media and political landscape in very different directions. I would not say that there has been a recent uptick of anti-Semitism there. I would not say it's disappearing. I would say it's a constant that depending on the moment, it goes up and down. But Andres?
Yeah, no, I think that you're absolutely right. I think that except for Venezuela, there is a case apart. And sure. Venezuela is a very interesting story. One of the comments was relating that Venezuela was a very hospitable country to Jews, and now with
Absolutely, sure.
Chavez, it changed dramatically. But But most of Latin American Jews would not experience anti-Semitism in their daily life. They don't experience discrimination in the workplace. They don't experience, I mean, they have friends that are not Jewish. They are well. But the difference maybe with the main difference with the way anti-Semitism is expressed in other countries is that there's not that veneer of political correctness that prevents people from saying things that are biased or prejudice, right? In America, nobody would say openly certain things. It's not that they don't think it, just they don't say them. In Argentina, for example, which I know the most, it's not considered offensive to say, well, Jews and money have a relation, but it's the same way that people would say, and Spanish are dumb, and Italians are noisy, and Indians are brutish. Like it's like that openness to speak about those things in a way that to an untrained eye sounds very offensive, but it's part of a landscape there, and people don't interpret in the same way.
Yeah. I would like to, Susan, before you go to the next question, I would like to say that I have been fortunate to visit Venezuela many times, and I started visiting it in the 80s and have visited it until maybe about 2 years ago. And I could see that dramatic difference between the open, embracing, cosmopolitan Venezuela, where Jews played just an important role, and they were another immigrant group, to the arrival of Chavez and Chavismo, and to the turning of the Jewish community and of Jews and Jewishness and the whole country as a whole into a very different landscape. So I couldn't agree with the questioner more.
Yeah, and also a woman said that she grew up in Peru, and she and her parents never experienced anti-Semitism. Are there other countries where there really hasn't been much of it besides that in Venezuela?
I would say, I mean, depending on how you see it, I would say that if you ask some Mexicans of my generation, some of them will tell you that they have never experienced anti-Semitism. Others will tell you that they have been the target of verbal abuse or certain anti-Semitic attacks. My father was a prominent soap opera star, and at one point he was in a play in the 1960s that was like a very anti-Vietnam, and had some images of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the patron Virgin of Mexico, being placed on stage. And there were members of the ultra-right that jumped on into the stage and started beating people with hammers and with chains and with bats, fracturing their skulls and other bones, my father's hand included. In his case, he was targeted. The person that was hitting him said that, and because you're a Jew, you shouldn't be using the image of the Virgin in the way that you're using it. And it wasn't being used, it was just in a landscape. So it all depends. There are certain aspects, even in Peru, and with all due respect to the person there are aspects of the Spanish language that have elements that are anti-Semitic and that go without notice. For instance, the El Cerro del Judío, the mountain of the Jew. Most countries, most cities, from Barcelona to Mexico City, have a place where supposedly the Jews lended money, and it's called the Hill of the Jew. Or there are ways of saying Judaizar, to Judaize, when you are supposedly talking bad about Christianity. And that word is used all over Latin America. So it depends on the degrees, on the levels, on the nuances of is anti-Semitism or not.
And it also depends, like in my case, for example, it's also the kind of your level of tolerance to certain things change as you're living there. Like I would have never considered a graffiti an anti-Semitic attack. As long as nobody bleeds, it's not an attack. And now I do. Like now I think that's horrendous. But in my childhood, you would see, graffitics with swastikas, and it would be part of the landscape, and a part of the many political messages, quote unquote, that you would see in the street. So there's a casual nature to bias and prejudice that doesn't exist in other parts of the world, and make people, is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's more pervasive. On the other hand, people are more immune to it. They don't see it as a problem the way we would see it here.
Mm-hmm. So we only have time for a few more questions. We'll try to get them in quickly. First, is the Holocaust taught to people in Latin America? And is Holocaust denial prevalent in Latin America?
Holocaust is hardly taught in Latin America, hardly. There are efforts by various organizations, many of them coming from the United States, to translate books and widely disseminate them, from the Diary of Anne Frank to Elie Wiesel's Night, to more child-friendly literature. But the vast majority of people in public schools are never exposed to Holocaust. This is mostly the stuff of private schools, of elites that are connected with America and with American films like Schindler's List and The Pianist and others. Deniers of the Holocaust, there are numerous in Latin America. They don't receive the prominence that they have in Europe or in England or in the United States. But I have been in many circles in Chile, in Argentina, where suggestions that the Holocaust didn't exist, didn't take place, or that the numbers are inflated, or that the Jews use this in order to create a Jewish state, to create guilt in other emotions from the world community in order to create a Jewish state. I have heard them many, many times. And
I'll add to that just one thing. I think Latin Americans, because they've been screwed by history many, many times, they fall a lot for conspiratorial thinking. So you tell them something happened, they said, are you sure? Who's telling us this? You know, like, so that contributes to Holocaust denial, to that kind of stuff. The other thing, the only caveat that I would say to what Ilan says is that in some countries, because of what you said, Ilan, about the military being so aligned or so, associated with the Nazis, there was a movement in the 90s and the late 80s to teach about the Holocaust, not because of the Jews, but to actually try to prevent another military government and sort of associate the two. So that there was a moment there in which there was a wave of trying to teach the Holocaust in Latin America, especially in Southern Latin America, Uruguay, Argentina, to associate the two.
Thank you. And lastly, someone said in Spain, many Jewish people have made the return, coming back and or converting to Judaism. Is this common in other countries? And somebody also wrote in and asked about the emerging Jewish communities and the B'nai Anusim. Can you comment on all of that?
Yes, those are fascinating phenomena. In Spain, the largest population is now immigrants from Argentina, from Uruguay, from Mexico, that is non-Spanish Jews, but Spanish-speaking Jews, Latin American Jews that now have reversed the first colonial effort, and now they are moving back to Spain. So you have non-Sephardic Jews in Spain, Ashkenazi Jews, that come from different traditions and have diversified the Spanish Jewish community. The case that calls attention the most is Cuba. Cuba, under Fidel Castro, Fidel Castro has had a very peculiar relationship both with the Holocaust, with the Jewish community, even with the state of Israel. And today there are approximately maybe 1,000 Cuban Jews, 1,500 Jews. Many of them are recent converts. Many of them racially come from very different backgrounds, mulattoes, Sambos, etc. It's fascinating. I've spent Shabbats in Havana, and it's just an incredible phenomenon of the diversity. Many of them were, because during the crucial years of the embargo, Cubans could not get medicines. The Jewish community in the United States would send medicines to the Jewish community in Havana. And so the best pharmacy, free pharmacy in Havana, was in the Jewish community, and people would come and then they would stay, and then some of them would become Jewish. And it was just an extraordinary phenomenon. And so you have in different parts of Latin America, very few, the idea that others that are not from that part have converted, but actually conversion is a very challenging possibility in the vast landscape of Latin America. It's not encouraged. Mixed marriages compared to the United States are small in number, probably more with the exception of Argentina than other parts, but in Mexico, it must be 10%, 8%, which compared to the United States is a minimal number. Now the Anusim, just very quickly, Susan, I am very interested. The Anusim are the secret Jews, the crypto Jews, or the hidden Jews. There has been a revival of the Anusim coming back to Judaism in northern Mexico, Sonora, Sinaloa, Nuevo León, the states on the northern border, and of course in the southwest in the United States, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, etc. I find this phenomenon to be riveting. There is a movement of new Latino Jews, Mexican Jews, nuevos judíos, that in some cases the traditional communities accept, as in Albuquerque or Santa Fe. In other cases they reject. And I find the stories of the Anusim to be really kind of the Jews within the Jewish history. They have kept themselves intact. They have fought for their own vision in fear, and there is a revival of them, even a new kind of religious outcoming that I find very, very interesting. And that is mainly in that region of the world. Andres, I don't know if you want to add something.
No, two data tidbits in order to complement what you said. First of all, Spain and Portugal are now giving citizenship to descendants of the Sephardim, and that's creating a lot of waves in the Jewish world. The second thing is that there is an estimation that around 15 to 20% of all the Europeans that came to Latin America during the conquest, during the Spanish conquest, were Jewish, were secret Jews, right? Nobody knows the exact data, but it's a very high percentage. So it is not inconceivable that millions of Latin American Christians are actually have Jewish descent. And the last point is a question that popped in the chat. I think it's interesting. There is a merger of Sephardic and Ashkenazi identity happening within the Jewish community in Latin America. Like, yes. Mexico was very stratified. If you were with the Syrians, you didn't go to the, Argentina too. It was considered a mixed marriage, a Sephardic and an Ashkenazi. Even a Galician and a Polisher was considered a mixed marriage, but let's not go there. But now there's more of a hybrid identity. There is a great website that is called Rusos y Turcos, Ashkenazis and Sephardim, that jokes about that hybridization of the Jewish identity within the community.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you both, Ilan and Andres, for this incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your own personal stories. I'm sorry to the audience that we couldn't get to more questions. There's so many, and there's a lot of questions specifically about each country. And so we'll look into what we can do in the future.
We'll have to do it again.
Yes, there's a lot of interest. A reminder that the book that Ilan mentioned, The Seventh Heaven, travels through Jewish Latin America. You can buy it at your local bookstore. We will be sending out a follow-up email in a few days with a link to this program, and I will include a link to the book. If there's anything, Andres or Ilan, you'd like me to include in that email, some links to things, I'm happy to do that as well. Again, thank you everybody for joining us. Please remember to go to momentmag.com, where you can sign up for our anti-Semitism monitor, and please be sure to register for next week's Zoominar, which is Adapting Jewish Literature. Again, thank you both, and we will see everybody next time.
Gracias. Thank you. Gracias, Andres.